now that we are on for a live audience, I want to again wish everybody good morning, maybe good afternoon, good evening to those who are joining us from other regions in the world. And welcome to the opening panel of our two-day workshop on advancing a just energy transition through multilateral action. I'm Hila Rasool, Director of Planetary Politics at New America. We are especially glad to be holding this conversation on the sidelines of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings, a moment when global finance leaders are gathered just blocks away from here to discuss the future of development, debt, and climate finance. I am thrilled to be joined by two leaders who are helping shape the future of multilateral climate and energy governance. This session will explore how countries and institutions from the Global South are not just participating in, but increasingly driving the conversation on equitable climate finance, sustainable energy access, and systemic reform. So it's a perfect way to set the tone for our conversations to come. We are joined today by His Excellency Ambassador Chola Milambo, who's the permanent representative of Zambia to the United Nations and co-facilitator of the upcoming UN Financing for Development Conference. Mr. Riyad Medeb is the director of the UNDP Sustainable Energy Hub. He leads efforts to support inclusive, just, and sustainable energy transitions aligned with national development goals. So I'll just kind of start off with a broad question to you both. What does a just energy transition look like from the vantage point of developing economies? Please, Ambassador.
Yeah, I can start. Well, thanks. Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation and all the work that you're doing to really bring out these discussions at a time when the world is actually very dynamic. Yeah, so the issue of just transition from the viewpoint, I'll speak from the viewpoint of Africa. From the viewpoint of Africa, this is actually an imperative. We don't need to explain too much, but if you just look at the pictorial picture of Africa, the global picture at night, that tells a story already. That you have a continent that is largely deprived of access to electricity, and with that has many ramifications for development. So a just transition would require that there's access to everybody, that is priced at the right price, that the incentives there to ensure that we transition out of fossil fuels into clean energy, and Africa has great potential. 60% of solar sits in Africa, but yet only 1% is invested there. So Africa needs justice. As a matter of fact, there's a view that access to electricity must be part of the set of human rights in that sense, because it links to everything. So a just transition requires that there's access, there's opportunity for each person to advance to their full potential, countries to invest in their citizens, invest in their economies. To a large extent, nothing can be produced without energy. I mean, if you really think about it, there's no single product or service that can be produced without energy, whether it's electricity or any other form of energy. So energy really is at the core of any life form or production. I think Africa, for the longest time, is yet to reach even very close to its full potential. So we present a lot of opportunities as a continent on this issue, and I think we need to speak very loudly about the situation that is taking place on the ground.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Mr. Medeb, from a multilateral institutions point of view.
No, thank you very much. And let me jump on what the Excellency Ambassador has just said about the case of Africa. You have 685 million people without access to electricity. Nearly 600 million of them are in Africa. But there's a number which is more important than that. You have 1.18 billion people energy poor. It means that you have access, but it is not affordable. And when we are talking about the just energy transition, we are talking about a clean and affordable energy, but sustainable. And I fully agree. If you go to the 2024 investment in renewable energy, for the first time, it doubled the fossil fuel, $2 billion. 80% of those investments goes in 25 countries. Do you know how much goes to Africa? A percentage. Any one of you?
3.
Less than 3. Close to 2. And the just energy transition, as you say, in the perspective of multilateralism, it is how we make sure the countries can benefit from those investments, how we make sure that it responds to the priorities of these countries, how we make sure that the countries are leading, how we make sure that we're linking the just energy transition to social protection, to the role, to gender equality. It is not just something that we put like spices and to make it good. It is the reality. There's no future without it. How we make sure that we take into account the governance perspective of investment in energy. And the just energy transition at the end, it is not just putting a bulb and putting electricity somewhere. It is a question of linking the energy to the development, like Ambassador Shola just said. It is the question of livelihood. It is a question of energy for health. 60%, and I'm giving you a number, 60% of the health facilities in sub-Saharan Africa lack of access of reliable energy. Just energy transition, it is not a choice. It is a human right. And we should not accept that 685 million people are lack of energy. We should not accept that 1.18 billion people are energy poor.
Thank you, and thank you to you both for setting the stage for the next question. I mean, what we've been seeing in a lot of global climate policy-making fora and the national needs of a lot of, especially climate-vulnerable Global South countries, is a bit of a disconnect between their national priorities and what's happening within these fora. So what are institutions like the UNDP, or how can they help close the gap between those national and community needs and those global commitments that are being asked of these countries on sustainable energy access?
Okay, I was preparing because, you know, they share with us the questions. Thanks a lot. And when we have several speaking roles, we need to prepare. So this morning I was preparing and I was explaining to our moderator, I was preparing and I was trying to collect certain numbers because that puts questions into perspective. And I was going to the case of South Africa. Let me give you some key numbers. So, access and the perspective of the national priorities and the global trends and global priorities, access is not longer about access to electricity. It's a question of security. First, number one is a question about security. And a country like South Africa is taking a step forward on the clean energy future. The country aimed to add approximately 50 gigawatts of renewable electricity capacity by 2030. However, a just energy transition strategy is not about installing capacity. It's much more than that. It represents an opportunity for inclusive development, what we just said together a minute ago, to enable the local economies and empower communities. By localizing manufacturing of solar panels, this is what we just discussed when we were in the other room, inverters, wind turbine, like in Namibia, cables, battery. So in this case, the country seeks to generate 25,000 of new jobs by 2030. So it is not just a question of electricity. It is from the perspective of just energy transition and the opening remarks of the CEO of New America. But how UNDP is helping the countries from the global south and try to close the gap between national needs and the global commitment. First of all is at the financial level. Number one, we help government to design financial mechanism in order for them to be able to attract the right investments. So you need one, the policy de-risking and financial de-risking. Policy de-risking in order that the country can not only attract investment, but target the right investment that will benefit to the economy. Financial de-risking because you need to make sure that the countries have the capacity to make sure that the private sector will be playing a key role. So putting in place guarantee schemes. It's one examples. And I give you an example what we were able to do in a small country in Latin America, in Uruguay. How we supported the government to repurpose the fossil fuel subsidies and develop the first electrical transportation strategy implemented and attract more than $14 million just in that. Just repurposing the fossil fuel subsidies, one example. The second element is about, I said first is on the financial perspective. The second element is about the triptych that I call digital, data, and AI. Very important for the future, very important for the just energy transition. And the AI currently on the energy transition has the capacity to reduce by 50% the cost of energy. And this is very important. And this is what we are doing with the program in 21 African countries called the Africa Mini Grid Program, where we are helping local providers to adopt digital solution and model like pay as you go to expand clean energy, access to over 66,000 people. The third level, so remember we said the financial level, the second level is the triptych AI, data, and digital, and we can talk a little bit about it a little bit later, is about energy as a catalyst for broader development. And that is, for us, essential. And let me give you a very interesting number. Every dollar invested in energy resilience for public institutions can deliver triple return access in health, education, climate adaptation. And I'll give you an example in Afghanistan, what we were able to do. One of the world's most energy insecure contexts, I'm calling about, we talk about energy security. Solar power delivered access to 3.6 million people, nearly 5,700 public institutions, including more than 700 schools and health centers. That is the link between energy, sustainable energy, and development.
Thank you so much. And you gave away our secrets. Ambassador Milambo, given your role as a co-facilitator of the Financing for Development process, as well as your engagement in the Pact for the Future, can you give us insights into the intersectionality of how these different sectors are colliding in these different processes?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me just step backwards and maybe just paint a broader picture of, firstly, the landscape. I should have done it earlier on. Firstly, we have to recognize that in Africa, demand is outpacing supply.
Right.
And the economies are raging forward, mainly because of population growth. We expect in Africa to have 2.5 billion people by 2050. There's also the process of urbanization that places demand on electricity, and also the issue of industrialization. So those are the going trends that are influencing the demand to outstrip supply. At the same time, Africa faces a challenge of access to finance, African countries, access to finance, and when it gets that finance, the cost is very high for various reasons, whether it's credit rating agencies, the ratings that come out of there, the issues of perceived risks. Then there's also the underinvestment that takes place in infrastructure. So there's a concoction of different issues that see Africa having a very low electrification rate. Like was put forward, 600 million of the 680 something in Africa, that's 43% of the population. And if you go to the rural areas, it's actually much higher in the rural areas. So that is the context that we're in. The investment that is needed requires that we connect at least 90 million people every year between now and 2030. That points to the need for huge, huge investments. At the same time, like I mentioned earlier on, the opportunity for green technologies in Africa is vast. Whether it's solar, whether it's energy through hydro, whether it's geothermal, it's vast. And the question is, how do you close that gap? You have this great need, you have potential to invest, how do you close the gap? Now, there are several things that must be put in place. One of them is really just the institutional reform that ourselves as countries are undertaking to ensure that our utilities must be financially sound. They must have the capacity to undertake large-scale projects. I mean, just in Zambia alone, we have one project which can light up almost the whole Southern Africa. I mean, we have the Batoka project sitting between Zambia and Zimbabwe, which can light up 5 countries. It's a $6 billion project. How do you attract investment to that one? We have the famous Inga 3 dam in DRC, which can potentially light up the whole of Africa, 100 gigawatts or something like that. So how do you close that gap? In financing for development, there's a clear recognition that there's need to invest in infrastructure. It's there actually in the introductory paragraphs. They need to invest in energy and also to invest in clean energy. And in the document, you see that member states have been, because the document is still under negotiation, member states have been pushing for recognition for common but shared responsibility, meaning that it reflects the shared burdens that we have. The historical issues, that's where the justice component comes in, as a matter of fact, that we must be able to reflect the historical contributions that have been made and the burden that is on African countries to fill that gap. African countries, like other developing countries, have the burden of not just investing in infrastructure, but to have to weatherize that investment, meaning that the cost of investment is not reflected by the historical record. We have to place additional funds there to ensure that our investments are resilient. Now, it's important that all those things are reflected in the FFD document. They're reflected in other points of discussion. They were reflected in the Summit of the Future document. We're involved in that one. As a matter of fact, we were leading on the Global Digital Compact in the drafting of that document. And so we see these things reflected in many, many documents. And it's important that, that member states, as they negotiate, do not lose these core components of energy investment in infrastructure.
Well, I mean, that leads me to my next question. I mean, a lot of what's coming up in these conversations is the big financing question. And yet, we, I would say, are in the weakest point for multilateral action since the history of these systems, since the Bretton Woods systems were set up. And financing is facing a precipitous fall. Not just due to U.S. foreign policy, but a number of other donors are stepping back. And so in light of this, what we're facing is this massive financing gap beyond what we're already facing. What are some strategies that need to be employed?
I can take that one. Firstly, we have to, I mean, I say we are talking about all countries, must recognize the changing landscape. That's the first thing. And then we must seek to enhance domestic revenues, all right? So meaning that we have to look firstly at our own, I mean, fundamentally, development is financed by domestic resources, all right? And so we need to enhance our capacities. So internally, most countries will point to 15% minimum of tax to GDP ratio, tax effort, as indicative of the capacity of a country to cover its essential services. In the document, the FFD document, again, it points to a commitment to support countries that are willing to reach that level. It will be important that we address also, I mean, there's enhancing revenue, meaning that you broaden the tax base, increase efficiency in your tax collections, In informal sector, you deal with that. You improve tax administration, including through digitalization. Now we talked about AI and how AI can just enhance revenue. You seal the loopholes, so illicit financial flows need to be dealt with. Other leakages would include even excessive debt payments. So the debt issues need to come into play. So that's the whole basket of improving domestic revenue. The other component, you would have to look at, okay, fine, how do we leverage our partnerships, right? So partnerships come into play here. The issue of efficiency and fragmentation in the international development cooperation is an issue that is of concern. I think countries need to employ cooperating partners to streamline their processes for development cooperation. Countries also need to approach institutions like the UNDP for partnerships or other multilateral institutions to leverage the convening power that they have. He talked about the ability to help different countries in different parts. There's the convening power, and what derives from it is the learning process. Enhance South-South cooperation. We have to really work on those partnerships. One thing that is actually appreciated at this point in time is the importance of triangular relationships, where we have two southern countries operating with a MDB in the middle to provide either financing or knowledge. The other component, I think, is exactly what we're doing here. How do we band together on international fora to remind the international community of the obligations that we all made 15 years ago, 10 years ago with the SDGs? How do we come together at different fora, FFD4, the World Social Summit, the Ocean Summit? We identify all these key strategic areas and ensure that we have consistent messaging throughout. In the UN, it's actually a bit more interesting because the voice of the developing South in the UN is much stronger than anywhere else because there we have one country, one vote. And so the share of one small country is the same as any other large country elsewhere, mostly, unlike the case in MDBs. So that becomes a strategic platform on which to advance many of these issues. But there has to be consistency. There has to be consistency, there has to be capacity. And the capacity comes from workshops like this. I heard about the compendium you want to put together. How do you get that information now into the policy dialogue? How do you get it to the right groups? You have to understand the landscape at the UN involves engagement through G77 for the Global South and also with other groupings there. So how do you get these issues into these groupings so that strategically you can have a conversation around the core issues?
Thank you, Ambassador. And Mr. Badab.
Yes, I fully agree. The development does not depend only on ODA. Let's put it in another perspective. You need multilateralism for one reason, because you need to dialogue. We need to discuss with all of us. Disagree and agree, but find solutions together. And that is a first necessity. So the UN system and UNDP in each country, where we are 23,000 staff in 170 countries and territories, has this role of convening the different actors at the national level, at regional level. But what is important here in financing for development, what we can learn from countries to another countries. And the reality is not only North-South, it's really more and more South-South. Look at the role of the BRICS in some regions and new financial institutions. Look at what is doing now Italy, very interesting with the Plan Mattei on investment for Africa and the last G7 initiative of energy for growth. The most important thing, it is not question of financing, it's investing where. So it's developing a pipeline of bankable project in a very concrete way. Because money, we can find it. What we need is to support the countries to develop that pipeline of bankable project. Number one. Number two, to work on the framework, on the regulatory and institutional framework in order to attract foreign direct investment. But to make the domestic private sector very dynamic at the same level than in foreign direct investment. Number three, to make sure that we are putting in place a financial de-risking instrument in order for the private sector to be able to play a key role in funding that. If you have these three levels, you can finance the just energy transition. Whatever is the crisis situation, the fact that we have multilateralism, it is where we can find solution all together, and we know what we need. The Global South is leading its future. They need capacities. We build the capacities all together. They need financial instrument. We develop financial instrument at the local level with government. We help them to develop their own financial instrument, not taking an example and implementing it. No, learning from others and developing an it.
Thank you so much. I mean, in addition to financing, as you all rightly noted, there are the factors that must be considered and encouraged in advance. And one of the things that we talked about in the back room is the importance of technology transfers in advancing an energy transition. So what has this looked like so far, and what can it look like? And why is there this need for technology transfer, especially north to south, south to south? What does that look like?
Well, I think, and we just came out of an STI forum under ECOSOC. So technology transfer is a key issue here. Of course, the question is what terms? And so it's usually understood that technological transfer has to be voluntary. And so that's the issue of now multilateral collaboration that must take place. As Global South, something that we really push for, because we know that a country moves from one frontier to another by using its resources, but also it can leapfrog through technological transfer. We also acknowledge that technological transfer can take place from government to government, and that's why the issue of collaboration now becomes key. Diplomacy becomes very important. But we also recognize, to hang on to the private sector issue, that technology transfers fundamentally and sustainably undertaken within a product. It's usually embedded in a product. And so private sector investment now becomes cardinal. Allowing foreign direct investment to flow becomes important, because that's the channel through which sustainable technological transfers take place. The issue of de-risking comes into place. So how do you get this FDI flow coming to the developing world? And the issue that you'll find, I keep going back to the document, FFD4 document, is the issue of aligning development incentives with the profiteer incentive. And if we're able to get that right, then it means that many of the areas where we need to undertake development requiring technological transfer comes embedded through FDI, foreign direct investment. So that's just some of the areas which I think are important.
One element which is also essential in terms of technology transfer is the national innovation system in a country. You need to put in place the right framework for it. For example, it was the case in Ethiopia, the case in Morocco. For example, in Morocco, do you know that Morocco now has an aviation industry? 15 years ago, there was nothing. National innovation system in place, which means you put the engineering schools, you put the private sector, you put the public sector, and you put the foreign sector all together, connecting to each other. That will help the foreign direct investment. That will help to direct the capital to the national priorities. Technology transfer is possible if you put a system where you can innovate and you can absorb the technology. It is also, the second level is the negotiation with the investors. In most of the countries now, what is happening, take in the case we were discussing, take the case of the solar panels. More than 80% they are coming from China. They are number one in terms of innovation production all around the world. But what is happening, and we see it in many African countries, where there is an investment in renewable energies, where you have the biggest potential, is in the African continent. You have also now not only the fact they are importing solar panels, they are producing them. They are building the local capacities, though they are signing the right agreement in order to put in place the manufacture there. And this is what I said from the first question in the case of South Africa, which will help to create 26,000 jobs by 2030. And this is happening. This is not a hope. This is a reality. Our role altogether, and then on the financing for development, is to accelerate the pace now.
Well, this also brings me to the question of, somewhat related, the question of critical minerals and the role that has to play in the development of these renewable technologies and then the deployment of them. And you know, the geopolitics of that are incredibly fraught. But what opportunities are there for especially those global south countries that house a number of these critical minerals to be, you know, to have a lot more sovereignty and governance over how those minerals are extracted and how they are distributed?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of critical minerals now is an important issue. I mean, we're moving towards EV batteries. And so the components, so it's cobalt, platinum, and the like, magnesium, all those are seated in Africa to a large extent. I think firstly, country needs to undertake a geological survey, right? What is the stock take? What do we have?
Right.
And in the case of Zambia, we've undertaken an aerial survey of the whole country. We're just in the process of finalizing the results. So at a certain point, we'll first know exactly what we have across the whole country. And on that basis, we'll be able to better manage our wealth, so to say. So it starts with taking stock, ensuring that the institutions in place for the mining sector, the extracting, the exploration are sound. Your policies for investment in the critical areas are sound. Your logistical framework now to transition to allow for the export of the material is important. But I must underline here the importance of value addition. Yeah. Because we should not make the original sin, so to say, of underdevelopment, which is getting stuck in the level of primary production and where we're exporting primary products. We must be able to add value to our products and then export them. Collaboration with other countries is going to be very important, both in the scope, in the area of transportation, logistics, and in the area of just joint production. Already DRC and Zambia have a joint agreement around the production of EV batteries technologies. So that's just an example of how countries are working together. So it's going to be a very interesting area to look at. Geopolitically, I think for developing countries, it's an opportunity to talk to whichever side. All right, it's a competitive world. And we fundamentally are looking at development. And most developing countries don't really pick east or west, by the way. We pick development. All right, and we pick our collaboration on the basis of who brings what development. And we recognize the different strengths of different cooperating partners. And so we are still in the 101 of development, and that becomes a critical criteria to determine who exactly we're partnering with. But I think we have a great opportunity in better pricing our products, better trading them, adding value to those products. And I think we are sitting at the beginning of a very interesting era.
It is.
Yeah.
One additional element, from electrical vehicles to solar panels to battery system storage, by 2040, the demand on critical minerals will quadruple. 30% of the critical minerals are in Africa. 50% are in the global south. But Africa benefits from it from only 10%. The revenue that they will bring is around $16 trillion. 10%. That's it. What is needed is the added value. It is clear. The capacity to process locally, transform locally, and develop clear industries. This is a necessity. But you need it not only for the global energy, but you need it also more and more for the expansion, rapid expansion of AI. And all the data system that you are putting in place. So the perspective of AI in the North will depend from the critical minerals from the Global South. Without a clear dialogue between them, there will be no possibility. What does it mean? It means that data servers cannot be just sitting in the Global North, but should sit also in the Global South. You reduce the cost. The link to critical minerals is not only about renewable energy, the beauty of it. It is linked to the development of AI, but it is linked to the owning the data that are used in the Global South and in the Global North. And that's where is the innovation taking place. So critical minerals are also the raison d'être of the innovation from the Global South. And it is happening in several countries in the Global South where you have innovation on renewable energy through critical minerals. So.
Thank you so much. I feel like I've taken us through a perilous journey, but I do want to open it up for audience questions. So what we'll do, we'll have one live participant question, and then we'll turn to questions from our virtual participants, should there be any. So are there any questions from our in-person participants?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, and thank you to our panelists for those great insights. Actually, I've been participating last month and actually yesterday in roundtables with your minister about critical minerals, and yesterday was the ministers from Angola. And, you know, regarding the issue of adding value and creating capacity within countries, but also creating a broader economic ecosystem where, for instance, the Lobito Corridor project that connects the DRC, Angola, and Zambia is not simply about extractivism and exporting raw materials, but also is an opportunity for investment in the agriculture sector, for instance. But when the message I've been hearing from the private sector, especially from the United States, is very much an interest in critical minerals extractivism specifically. I haven't heard really, momentum and interest investing in other economic sectors that will indeed benefit from economic development and livelihoods. So, you know, the same way that there is a big challenge to get those investors to invest in, value-added industries, I think we are seeing an even bigger challenge when it comes to agricultural investments, for instance, around the Lobito Corridor project. So how do you foresee, addressing this issue, and how do you bring those investors where you want them to go? And again, moving away from simply extracting raw materials and not simply building manufacturing capacities, but really looking at other sectors such as agriculture, which I think is very much needed as well on the African continent. Thank you very much.
Please go ahead, one by one.
Okay, so we can address them one by one, but thank you very much for that very good question, because it allows me to get into the more fundamental issues. Why does a country develop? Mm-hmm. What is at the nexus of the development of a country? It's actually structural transformation, all right? There's no country that has graduated from underdeveloped to advanced without going through a structural transformation in its economy, right? There are a few handful in the Middle East, but fundamentally, by and large, a country goes through a process where it starts from producing primary products, then it gets into secondary products, then finally tertiary products, right? And through that process comes a different distribution of wages. You get more value when you start producing. The workers in urban areas get more money than those in the rural, and eventually that has an impact positive on poverty reduction. And we've seen that in Asia, we've seen it in different countries, continents. The question is just the pace at which it takes place. And you have projects like the Lobito Corridor is fundamental in the sense that it allows this process to move forward. Infrastructure around rail or transportation is key. Here in the US, in the 1800s, the Vanderbilts of this world and others developed this country, helped develop the country through investment through rail, right? And that's how the country opens up. And then, of course, you have the highways through the Eisenhower project, 1950s, I think. The country opens up and connectivity happens. So in Africa, we're at a point where we really need to invest in rail line to lower the cost of transportation. Countries that are land-linked, like Zambia, connectivity is a big issue. So depending on trucks most of the time, but we need to get this load onto the rail so that we lower the cost of production. So that's the broader issue. Coming down to the Lobito Corridor, which is a key strategic corridor for Zambia, DRC, Lobito. And as a matter of fact, it's supposed to connect all the way to Tanzania on the eastern side. What we've seen in Zambia, and we have had a very elaborate rural roads project, is that when you run a road through a place which is basically wilderness, a bush, eventually economic activity builds up around those corridors, right? It's a rare case of where supply creates on demand, so to say. And so we expect that as the connectivity takes place, yes, the rail line will be put there. We think other investors definitely will come through. Already we have local investors who are looking at establishing their own investments along the rail line. We have in the border between Zambia and DRC, there's a large mining enterprise taking place, I think in Kolwezi, just across in DRC. And already the spillover investments that take place. So usually it happens organically, that you're going to have investments following that area, but of course you're going to have policy that is encouraging investment to go there. The enabling environment, we get back to the enabling environment. Fundamentally, it's going to be about the enabling environment. Countries like ours provide protection of private property. As a matter of fact, Zambia is one of the few countries that even allows externalization of profits. And so the enabling environment is key. Stable policy, consistent messaging. I think those are the key issues that will allow investors to come through. The potential in Zambia and Africa generally is huge in terms of agriculture. UNDP can go on for hours talking about the potential there. But there's vast potential in agriculture, food processing, by the way, yes. Agriculture, food processing in the northwestern province, which is where the Lobito Corridor will pass in Zambia. Already we have industry around pineapple, and we already do juicing in that space. And then even just closing the differential between Angola, price differential between Angola, which is a very expensive city, and Luanda, a very expensive city, and Zambia would be able to transport goods across this corridor. We know Angola imports from as far as Brazil for some of its livestock, chickens and things of that, fish. We can easily produce it within Africa and then increase the intra-African trade. So we expect it to have it both organically and also through direct initiative.
I will add another perspective is the one that the Secretary General of United Nations has established a panel on the critical energy transition minerals in 2024 that set up 7 principles which are very important on the extractive and the governance of extracting the critical minerals, so that we have a global framework for it. That is one thing. We need to see also that the presidency of the G20, the South African, has put already the critical minerals at a very high level, where they decided to push for building regional industries, where we build all the battery systems, solar manufacturing, all in the global South. But let me give you 2 examples that are happening now. The case of Zimbabwe has already introduced policies to regulate its lithium export and promote local value. This is a government itself. The case of Chile is reshaping its lithium strategy to ensure that public benefit from private extraction. So governments are already moving. So at the global level, we have now the 7 principles, but at a national level, government are taking already decisions that it is not just a question of extracting, it is a question of adding value, it is a question of linking it to the development of local industries.
Is there?
No online questions yet, but just a reminder for the online audience to use the Slido chat box to the right of the YouTube, and that's where you can ask any questions. But let's take another one from the audience.
Great. There's.
Thank you very much, the panelists, for the insights. So the issue of China arises when you talk of critical minerals in Africa. I think probably more than 60% of the mining space in Africa is taken by China now. They also have developed their own processing capacity, such that a lot of the minerals coming from Africa are processed in China and supplied to various global, centers. How do we disrupt this value chain, which is kind of a continuation of the resource curse, where Africa is a particular division of labor supplying raw minerals? At first it was to Europe, now it is to China. What mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that the issues we've talked about, like the Lobido corridor, really expand to the continent in general? Thank you.
It's a hot topic.
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, as Zambia, we invite investment from across the globe. We're not really selective as to where that investment is coming from. We have a very neutral FDI policy. But the issue is that the question, the way I understand it, is the issue of localization, which is how much local ownership is there. Mm-hmm. I think that's the fundamental issue here, regardless of the concentration outside. So in our policy, we encourage partnerships. In fact, there are more incentives if it's a Zambian company by definition of the law than a country that is necessarily foreign. A Zambian company cannot even own land in that sense. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the policies that you need to put in place as developing countries to ensure that you have local content in it. Local content across the whole value chain, because it's one thing to be in extractives, but you also need to enhance this local content now in the processing. Because while we have mines that are going through the mining process, there's also the processing of the raw material that needs to take place, and that's an opportunity as well. Already we have local persons who are looking at how they set up the processing plants. In Zambia, we have all sorts of minerals. Mm-hmm. From tin to lithium to copper, gold, we have it all. And by the way, we're having these discoveries every other month. So folks leaving their jobs, former jobs, to go start up these issues out there. The issue is capital and capacity. That is the part of the key issue. So how do you now create empowerment? And that's the question, I think. How do you create empowerment mechanisms for the local folks to invest in these sectors? Mm-hmm. How do you partner? I mean, and the partnership may bring the technology and the know-how. That's a capacitation issue. But on the empowerment, I think there's some scope to think about how do you collateralize the tenements that you found underground, right? Because if you have the exploration license and the mining license, and you're sitting on $1 trillion worth of dollars worth of gold, then there should be a way of capitalizing or securitizing the assets that you're sitting on, so that you can establish the processing plant and minerals around it on the guarantee that you have rights to the gold that's sitting in the belly of the soil. So those are some of the, I think, the challenges that developing countries need to face. partnerships, capacitation, access to finance to extract them.
That's important. If I can attach one more thing, just the investment in communities, too. If you would.
Yes, for UNDP, the critical minerals, most of the time, where do you see them? Where you have indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
So the role of UNDP is to help the indigenous communities benefit from those resources. And that is why very important. But there will be no clean energy future, it means, from battery system to electrical vehicles to wind turbine without critical minerals. So the Global South is in a very positive position. Not in a weak one, it's a very strong one, because they are not only the supplier. The future will depend on them, but I agree on the capacities. If you want to add values, the first thing is to invest in human capital. Do you know that in Iran, every year you have 250,000 engineers coming up from schools? 250,000 engineers every year. And that's how they can keep their energy system to be developed. Because it's not a change of perspective or strategies. It's a question of fundamental change of systems, of energy system. And for that, you need to have the human capacities to be able to use the critical minerals, not to be just exported as raw materials, but to be able to be transformed. So it is happening in many countries. What we need to do is build those bridges between the Global South countries to learn from each other and having these regional strategies like proposed in the G20, currently presidency of South Africa.
Yeah, I think the regionalism question is a critical one. Is there one from, please?
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Claude Kabemba. I'm from the Southern Africa Resource Watch. Thank you so much for those points you've given us. I'm just quite intrigued by the current world order. Do you think we can build justice on an unjust global system? The world order post Second World War is built around power. Those who got power imposes their will. Now, I'm asking this because I think students of international relations will understand that only the pursuit of interest governs relations between states. This government in America wants to take critical minerals from the DRC, a country that is at its lowest in terms of capacity, dealing with a rebellion that is advancing, fighting. How are you sure that we can build justice in the current world system? What is it changing that persuade you that justice is possible when we have failed to build it for centuries? What is changing in your mind which convinces you that it's possible?
Okay.
It's highly political, so it's for you. I'm very happy to be just a development practitioner.
But I think you need to look at the historical arc, right? Mm-hmm. How far we've come across. And might I go as far back as slave trade, right? Just how far we have come across as human beings, whether it's slave trade, whether it's the civil rights era in this country. All those were major gross injustices that present a scar on the human conscience. But we're here in this current setup. It's unjust, it's imbalanced, but I think, there's a continuum that takes place. It bends slowly, sometimes it seems to be bending backwards, but I think the trajectory of human cooperation and decency and rights literally point north, so to say, in the right direction. And so I'm much more hopeful given where we are. I think the formation of the UN itself was a step in the right direction. 8 years now, and we still have a framework that allows us to collaborate. The challenges there, of course, is that the UN itself needs to be dynamic, whether it's Security Council reform or just the reform of how it's set up. But I think the fact that we have every country having a voice at the UN is something that just gives us hope, and that everybody, every country must have the right to present its case in these developments. I think we're reaching a stage where they say nothing about us without us. So there's something in those lines, basically saying that if there's going to be an international standard or a convention that is set up, then it shouldn't be imposed on a certain group of countries. We should have a voice in the cooking of it so that we are there at the dining thereof. So I think we're really reaching a point where the push for international collaboration, for everybody to be heard, is really at a fever point. And I think the Summit of the Future that was agreed in September was just a reaffirmation of the importance of international collaboration and cooperation in this matter. So I personally am hopeful, and I think the member states who signed up to the Summit of the Future are extremely hopeful about the promise of multilateralism and the importance of addressing cross-border issues. We cannot address them alone. In the global south, if we don't address a risk sufficiently, somehow it will manifest itself at someone's doorstep in the global north. So we're interconnected, and we have no other choice but hope in this situation.
We have no other choice than hope and optimism. And we are optimistic because we have a UN Charter. And this UN Charter is still valid. The way that we are implementing it, the structure of the UN, as Ambassador Shulo said, there will be reform, structures, changes for better efficiency. But when we start the UN Charter that we, the people of the world, if you're not optimistic about that, it's finished. You have to remain optimistic in order to be able to make changes. Never be defeated. The idea of the UN and the UN Charter is peace, is being able to have a dialogue, being able to have the right for a development, being able to protect our planet, as you started this morning the discussion with your mother. That is why we have to remain optimistic and to continue to build this better future. Not for the future generation, for us now, for 5 years, for 10 years, for in 20 years, for the current generation.
I'm going to end it on that message of hope. But I want to, again, thank you. A huge thanks to our panelists who have 9 other speaking engagements just today. And so I'm deeply appreciative that you helped us kick off this exciting dialogue.
Thank you.